Welcome to the CRO Talks podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite-sized chunk of content summarizing a recent roundtable discussion topic. So today we have a special topic around test targeting conditions. So we're going to be talking some technical details here and why that's exactly so important. We also have a special guest with us who has some very specific experience regarding this as well. But first, Iqbal has a really good sort of teardown of the exact topic, and he in fact has even prepared some slides for it.
I wouldn't say really good, but let's get
I said really good.
On this. You said really good. So here's the classic.
It's really adequate.
Yeah. Iqbal has presented an adequate intro into test triggering.
That's right.
So here's a classic diagram of an A/B test, and typically you see this a lot. A, and then you have the group of A, and then B, you have the group in B. Now this I really don't like as a diagram because it's missing a lot of the nuance. An actual thing of what is actually happening to traffic is that you have your A group, you have your B group, but more importantly, you also have a group that is not counted into the test. So you have an A group, people who count into A, B group, people who count into B, and then you have people not counted.
So targeting on the most basic level is deciding who should be included in the experiment versus who shouldn't be for users that are coming to the site or app or whatever, wherever you're testing.
Yes, exactly.
That's the core kernel of what the definition of targeting is. But there's a lot of subtleties within that we think a lot of people don't actually account for, and that's what we're going to be getting into.
What we're going to be actually discussing, yeah. So this is what people think about when you think of A/B testing. So imagine you got a test on the third panel, scrolling down from a desktop. It's a third panel down. You might think, oh, yeah, it's the size of the audience, the size of the prize. It's that's your full funnel. But in actual fact, the number of people who scroll to that point could be a very small size in terms of the total amount onto that page, and then that would equal to a very much smaller size of the prize to do that. So here's what then trigger actually is when you look at variant versus control, and you got that third panel when you scroll down. A trigger is essentially what users you count into an experiment. So you want to make sure that you're only counting the people that you need. So yeah, that's a very quick overview of what triggering is. Hopefully now we can jump straight into the main chat. Let me stop sharing, and gonna introduce
our special guest for today.
Our special guest for today, and really, this is somebody who it almost feels like I've been modeling myself off of him. So it's really good to have this special guest on this show. So Jonas Alves, did I say your name correctly?
Perfect. Thanks, Iqbal.
Okay. He's a co-founder and CEO of AB Smartly. He's xbooking.com, where he helped develop the platform to build an experiment program. He was also the product owner of experimentation there, and was responsible for experimentation training, features being added, reports being built, and metrics being added, etc., etc. But it's super big brain. After that went over to found AB Smartly. Really great to have you on the show, Jonas.
Thank you, Iqbal. It's great to be here.
Did he miss anything there in that?
Did I miss anything?
It's more than enough.
Cool. So in order to like a jumping off point in terms of like a trigger, was there anything missing from that sort of like a very quick overview? Is there anything else we want to add in order to explain what a trigger is, and especially get into some of the complexities of the trigger?
I would just say that most tools nowadays, they do triggering automatically, right? Not
Yes.
for that case that you were showing where you need to scroll to the page, right? For that, you still need to do it because you need to customize the triggering for that, because most experiments by default, when you check for what to show to in the page, when you check that, it triggers the event, right? So
Yeah.
it does that before that part of the page is shown to the user. So when the page loads, it triggers everyone that goes to that page, right? So in that situation, it will not do the right thing. So it will not trigger only when the user is exposed to the change. But in most cases, if it is on below the fold, right, so on the top, it will do the right thing for you. Many tools before, like many internally built, so tools built in-house, like years ago, 10 years ago, would not have triggering, right? So people sometimes would do the triggering later on after the fact by filtering the events that were actually exposed to the change, right? But nowadays that's something that is not really needed, like because tools do triggering by itself, so you could do it in real time, basically.
Now, when you say the tool does triggering by itself, what you mean is that it has configurations to allow you to set that up. Like it's not automatic in that sense of like the person building the test still has to provide some sort of input. And usually that's like URL based targeting. So they're doing some sort of string matching, say like, oh, I want to target product pages on my site, and product pages are defined with like the word product in the URL string somewhere. So you say like, okay, all URLs that have the word product in it are targeted for this test or something like that. That's like most tools have targeting, at least on that very basic level. Some of them have more advanced capabilities and features, but a lot of the time it ends up being developer fallback, where an actual engineer has to develop some sort of conditions or solutions using like typically like JavaScript or something like that to get some more defined criteria outside of just a page load or a screen load in an app, right?
Yeah, what I mean is that when you check for the experiment, right, it sends an event saying that, hey, this experiment was exposed, right?
Mhm.
So all the
Yeah.
tools do that, sends that event, basically, right? And I was comparing that with the home-built tools before that, where you would do the coin flip, but it would not send events, right? Later, you would filter the data in your database, in your data lake, to find out which users were actually exposed to the change, and that event was not being sent at all, right? So nowadays,
So you count
the event
all
is
the
always there.
traffic and then you segment afterwards.
Yeah. But nowadays, that event is always sent. You just need to be sure that you sent it only when the user is exposed to the change, and that might not be always trivial, right? So sometimes you trigger it too soon, and you are tracking more people than actually will be in the experiment later.
So why is triggering so important? I think it's worth kind of
Like
going into
why
that.
would we have moved away from just putting everybody into the test? Like what are some of the reasons for setting up targeting conditions?
Yeah, well, it's important because that amount of people that Iqbal talked about that are outside of the test are just adding noise to your data, right? Because they were not exposed to the change. So the actions that they are making in the website will not move the needle, right? They didn't see the change.
Yeah.
So if that group is very large, you lose a lot of sensibility in your test. So you need to run the experiment for a much longer period, right? If it is small, then it's fine, right? If it doesn't add too much noise, then it's fine. You can live without it. But if the noise is too big, you go a lot faster. You make faster decisions by removing those users from the data.
Yeah, so a lot of it is about sensitivity in the test read afterwards. If you got a lot of noise, then it means that your sensitivity for measuring a change impact of your variation is muddied. Pretty
Exactly.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And is there also an issue with SRM as well?
Yeah.
'Cause I'm thinking specifically
Let's
for
very
some of
briefly
the.
explain what SRM is as well, because we talk a
Oh,
lot of technical stuff and we tend to skip over things. So
very good
SRM
point.
stands for sample ratio mismatch, which is essentially a difference between the amount of users in a actual amount of users that are placed in variations versus the intended design. So say, for example, you want your test evenly split 50-50 between the control and the variant, and you look and you see like, oh, 100 people have been placed into the control, but 50 people have been placed into the variant. Well, you were expecting an even split, and 100 versus 50 is not an even. That's a sample ratio mismatch. There should be equivalent within a reasonable degree because they should be randomly assigned as well.
And the issue there is about confounders, is about the type of users that you got in a specific group. So you may be missing a cohort of users in one of the specific variations, which will influence one variant over another in a different way. So basically makes a comparison null and void. But yeah. So
And it's the factor of different versus actual. Like
yeah.
if you're running a test that's like a 60-40 split, and that's what your split is by design, then if your split is 60-40, that's not a sample ratio mismatch. It's not
Yeah.
that like it always needs to be equivalent. It's that the actual distribution matches your intended design.
Yeah.
Which we could record a whole other episode on SRM as well. In fact, we might have. I don't remember,
Yeah.
but
Exactly.
So
So, to answer your question, Matt. So, indeed, if you want to trigger only for the right users, many times the complexity increases in the code, right? Because you need to
yeah,
check for that corner case that where the user is actually exposed to the experiment. That might be a smaller amount of traffic. And by doing that check and only triggering at that point, you might make a mistake and trigger more in one variant than in the other variant. For example, let's say that you want to make a change in a form submission before the form is showing an error message if you submit the form without filling a specific field. And you want to, instead of submitting the form in that case, you want to show a JavaScript error saying, hey, this field is mandatory, and you don't submit the form at all because you don't need to submit it if the mandatory field is not filled, right? So in that case, you want to trigger the users only when they submit the form with that field empty, right? So you need
right.
to
Because
check for that.
if they don't submit, there's no potential for them to have been exposed
Exactly.
to the error, and you're testing the error state. So if the user doesn't fulfill the conditions of seeing what change you're testing, they in general shouldn't be included in the experiment. There are, different scenarios there, but
Exactly. And the change in this example is that in one variant, the form is still submitted, and in the other variant is not submitted, and we just show the JavaScript error, right? And because of this change, in one variant you submit a form, you might lose tracking because the browser submits the form and the tracking event for the user is lost. Like the browser stops sending that request to the backend, that event that will trigger the user is lost because the browser the form is submitted, and in the other variant is not, right? So in one variant you track all the users, and in the other you have users that were not counted, right? And this creates a sample ratio mismatch. So it's more likely that you create these errors when you try to do the right triggering, right? Because it's not always easy to do it correctly.
Yeah, it does increase the risk quite substantially, because a lot of the times when I've seen SRM happening, it's because of the triggering conditions and really complex triggering conditions that kind of, like you just saying there. That is a real, that's something to really look out for.
yeah. And then another aspect of why targeting is important, and we've kind of already hinted at that, is power levels for your test, which is essentially evaluating like the signal to noise ratio within the test, and trying to balance that.
Yeah, actually, another case related to SRM that I see often, and this really trips up a lot of people here. And I just wanted to get your view on this, Jonas, in terms of how to go about resolving this, or to even approach this sort of thing. Is when you have a test where a feature is being added, so there's no feature currently on the site. A new feature is added, and often what happens is basically when the test is developed, then that feature is wrapped around a trigger to say, hey, when this new feature shows, then count users into a test. Well, in the control, that feature doesn't exist. So this always, I wouldn't say always, it trips up so many devs and so many product teams. And I just wanted to get your view on that problem, and specific ways in which you go about thinking about it, solving it, etc. Especially with Booking.com, where I know you guys were doing a lot of that sort of thing.
Yeah, so basically you need to trigger in the place where that feature would be shown, also in the control, right? You need to trigger the control. So usually what happens is that you have an if clause that checks, hey, in which variant is the user? Is it in variant A or variant B, or 0 or 1, right? When you do that check, it triggers that event, that exposure event, right? So you need to do it in the place where you would be showing that feature. What happens sometimes is that you do that check in a place that is not shown right away. For example, let's say that it's a pop-up or a model that will show up later. So you are checking for that before the user is exposed, and maybe not all the users will open the model, right? And
a good example of this would be like an exit intent modal. Like if you're trying to test the efficacy of adding an exit intent modal, well, on the control state, that exit modal doesn't exist to begin with, but you're testing like if you want to add it to the site or not. So you need to have some sort of targeting condition in place to say for the control of like, if this user would have triggered the exit intent, they should be included in the experiment.
Yeah, but that is simple, because in the place where you would show it on the variant, right? You need to check, hey, is the user in the variant? If he is in the variant, I show it, right? And just by checking that if the user is in the variant, you trigger the event in both variants, right? Right. So that works fine. The problem is when you want to do triggering correctly, and that in a place that is not shown right away, right? And then you have the issues that we discussed before.
Yeah, so like an API call or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So that should not be a problem. Usually it just works, right? It just behind the scenes it's doing the work for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's in terms of things like if an API call is being made in order to determine whether or not a feature should be shown. I mean, one way that I've kind of got people to approach it is to, like you say, Jonas, always show everybody's in the variant, and then for the control group, you hide that that specific feature or whatever it is, and then that way you kind of you have the same target conditions applied to everybody.
Yeah. I don't like very much to do that, because basically your control is not the real control, right?
Yeah.
If that experiment is not there, you are not adding that extra HTML that will be hidden, right? So you are, if something goes wrong,
there's some subtleties there, but you have to
exactly.
sacrifice like at a practical level, how can you get it to work within whatever system you're working
but sometimes you have to do that, right? Because sometimes you don't have a way to do it properly, or the complexity is so big. So there's always a balance, and that balance exists there with triggering as well, right? So because the risk is so much higher to add triggering in some cases, sometimes you might want to go without it, knowing that you'll have less power. If the difference is not big, like if you think that around 10% of the users will add noise, like if it is the other way around, then you should do triggering, right? If 90% will not be exposed to the change, you want to do the triggering. But if it is like 20%, 10%, then maybe it's better to not bother with it, right? Let's just track everyone and run it and lose a little bit of power just for the sake of simplicity, and be sure that we don't have bugs and more complicated stuff going on in the experiment.
And there's also something that we're probably going to get into a little bit later in terms of like when we talk about the Booking.com solution of multiple triggers and multiple trigger points in terms of working backwards. That's something else that we probably put a pin in this, and we can probably come back to this in a bit. But yeah, Matt, you were saying something.
Like, well, so triggering doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing either. There's levels of granularity and detail, right? Like you're getting it. It's like an 80-20 kind of rule. Like you're getting it good enough for being able to develop, engineer, and making sure that it's bug free. Like if you have some sort of complex targeting criteria, try and break it down into different steps of like, okay, I know I can do the URL targeting because the tool has pre-built configurations for that, and that's easy to do. And then can I easily do something where I'm monitoring like scroll depth to see like if the element is visible on the page? Like how easy or complex is that to do? Is the element hidden by default? Like does the user have to open a tab and then like what are the degrees of complexity there? And saying like, okay, I can take it this far to at least reduce some of the noise. I may not get rid of all of it entirely, but this is good enough for me to be able to get the test built and out the door within a reasonable time frame.
Exactly. And this is probably a good point to jump into. We'll jump into the Booking.com sort of multiple triggers sort of approach, actually. So from what I understand, Jonas, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Booking.com have a similar sort of way of doing it, but it's automated, i.e., there's multiple levels of fallback for a trigger. So if there is a SRM on a specific scrolling depth sort of trigger where you've got SRM between the control and variant, well, you can fall back on, well, who landed on that page or who even saw that module or something, and then go back and back and back. So so can you talk us through that a little bit, some of the tooling and sort of like extreme tracking functionality or super advanced tracking functionality that you put into place at Booking?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, because at Booking was so common to add new features that were adding complexity to the code and doing stuff that could slow down the website as well, then we felt the need to have more complex reporting, right? Or more detailed reporting on those changes as well, right? Because let's say that one change was being shown to the user only on the client side, but we had to run a query on the client side, on the server side, that was delaying the website by 100 or 200 milliseconds, right? So it was a complex query. And because we would not optimize the code in the first run, we would run something just to see, yeah, is this experiment good? And then we would improve it over time, right? So if it was something that was very complex to do, we would not improve the performance right away from the beginning, right? So we would find shortcuts to test it first to see if it was a good idea and improve it later. So sometimes the queries were not super optimized in the beginning, and it could slow down the website quite a lot. And we wanted to have visibility on that impact as well, right? So let's say that you have to run the query, and that query needs to be run for 100% of the users, but only 20% of the users will be shown that information later on in the client side, right? So you know that if that query is very bad, it will decrease conversion, and you want to know that. But if you track everyone, you lose the sensitivity on the change that is being done for those 20% only, right? So what we did was to implement what we called multi-stage triggering. So you trigger when on every change that you do on the funnel for that experiment, you do a different triggering. So you trigger the query, you trigger when the page loads, and you trigger when the user opens the pop-up and is shown the information, right?
Yeah, nice.
And then you can, in the dashboards, you have all the visibility. So if you want to know the impact of the query, you look at the first triggering to see users without a query, users with a query, what's the impact, right?
Nice.
Actually, you look at users without a query and users with a query but without the feature to know the impact of the query. To know the impact of the feature, you look at users that got a query but not a feature versus users that got a query and the feature. And if you know the total impact, you look at users without a query versus users with a query and the feature, right? So you can do those combinations to have 100% visibility on the impact of your experiment. And if you know that the feature is good, but the query decreases conversion, then you know, okay, I need to improve the performance of my query to go full on with this experiment. If the total impact is still positive, you might decide, okay, I'm going to deploy this to production, but add a note that I need to improve the performance of the query later if the query is negative, but the total impact is positive. But if the total impact is negative and the feature is positive, that's great information. You know that it's a good idea. At the moment, we cannot go forward with it yet, with this yet, but we can improve it to have a positive impact, right? So,
Nice.
And this is amazing because then you have all the information to make the right decision here, right? And many times what happened before we had this is that we would not have visibility about the performance impact because we would trigger only the users that were exposed to the experiment, or we would trigger everyone that got a query, and then we would not have sensitivity to make a decision on the change itself, right?
Yeah, and would that be with all of those different trigger points, is that's all serviceable on a self-serve dashboard, right? So it doesn't involve expensive analyst resource going in and having to do a lot of work to see those kind of triggers.
No, it's all self-serve. People, the developers just need to decide where they want to add the triggers, right? I want to add the trigger here for my query, and maybe I'll do it like 20% of the traffic is without a query and 80% is with the query, so that you have 80% of the traffic for your experiment later, right? Because it decreases traffic if you start doing this. It decreases traffic from step to step, right? To have all the visibility. So you lose a little bit of power by losing that traffic. So you need to play with that. I would not do 50-50 in the first one because you lose 50% of your traffic in the experiment itself, right? But if you do 20% 80, and then in that 80 you run 50-50 the other experiments, the real change, then you maybe have enough power.
Nice. That's a really sweet solution. So
I have a follow-up question here. So is there a difference between multi-layer triggering like that and, say, result custom segmentation, where like I'm trying to think of scenarios where like people are using off-the-shelf testing tools and trying to like sort of approximate this, where because I've done this in, say, like Convert and VWO and stuff, where you can create your own custom segments based on whatever you want. So I could say, like, I'm running a test on the product page, and I can have a custom segment for like, here, give me the result data for users that performed a particular activity, and you're segmenting the result data. Would you say that that's a good enough approximation for like off-the-shelf tools to be able to drill down like that? Now you'd still probably have to do like manual power checks and significance if the tool's not like re-rendering the report based on that, but it at least can give you some kind of data there.
Yeah, so if you can do the right segmentation, yes. So most tools, I'm not sure if most, but many tools do the segments only at exposure time. So if the user changes to a different segment later on, or let's say that the change is you want users that run a query, make a search on the website, right? A specific search on the website. So if they are triggering the experiment on the first search, and that search doesn't match the one that is interesting for you, the user is outside of that of the group already, right? Because you are triggering the first step that you are triggering as everyone in the experiment, right? Everyone
it's not as simple as a binary, like did this, didn't do this, right? Because someone can like come back multiple times. They can put themselves into or out of a particular segment. There's some subtle complexities there, and you need to like if your tool does that, you need to like really understand like how does it place people into a segment. Does it like once they've done the activity, are they always in it, or can they be taken out of it, etc.
Yeah. So basically, if the filtering, if it is possible to filter the total results of the or without triggering the experiment, without the triggering, if it is possible to filter out later the users that would be exposed to the change itself, then that's the best approach. But it's not always possible to find them out without adding that extra triggering. So what you can do as well, and we did this many times, was to run one experiment inside another experiment, but where the variants are always the same, right? So you basically they are in sync. Those two experiments are in sync, and one triggers for everyone, and the other triggers only for the users that are interesting for you. That will get actually the real change.
Right.
So in the inner experiment, you look at the impact for your feature, and in the outer experiment, you look at the impact for the total impact. What you lose in this case is the impact of the query only, right? Because the impact of the query as the users in both variants of the change, right?
Cool.
So now, uh, so we've kind of covered in pretty good depth all of the like technical details around triggering. Why do you think that this is something that people don't talk about very much?
I think it is because only experimentation teams that are running these complex experiments, so that are more sophisticated, would feel the need for this, right? There's still so many companies that are running very simple A/B tests, many times only client side, right? So I believe that now it will become more and more a theme, because I see more and more organizations going deeper into experimentation and starting experimenting more in multiple parts of the stack, right? Not only the web client side, but also the web server side, on the emails, on the apps, on the edge, right? There's a bunch of stuff. Your stack gets more complex, and as it gets more complex, people will find these more complex experiments or these more complex use cases, and we'll start talking more and more about it. I think it's mostly about the sophistication of the experimentation.
And also, there's a level of the sophistication of the application itself as well.
In terms application, in terms of the thing being tested, or the tools?
The thing being tested, because single page applications are becoming more and more common, where there's very little going back to the server, coming back between page views. Everything's just happening in the browser. So the app gets delivered, and then internally in the browser, there's this concept of moving from state to state, and what they call pages, what one team call pages, another team doesn't call pages, etc., etc. So and when it comes to that level of granularity, when you got a single page application and you got different states of a application, then your experiment is running in position X, then it starts to become at a point that you need to worry about triggering. You need to start talking about triggering, and when do you trigger people into an experiment? Would you say that's also?
Yeah, exactly that, and also the experimentation moving more from marketing into product and engineering as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Server-side testing as well. Yeah. Specifically
design feature testing versus copy contents. Yeah.
Exactly.
Visual layer testing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, are there any notable? Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, So in terms of like people don't talk about it, and we're saying that people maybe will start talking about it when it's more sophisticated. I'm of the mindset, and I'd like to get both of your views on this, that really everybody needs to at least understand triggering, and everybody needs to know about triggering. So product that involves product teams, product owners rather, analysts, and also developers. I wanted to get your guys' view on it in terms of like when you start to when you do kind of get sophisticated with your experiment program, and you do need to start thinking about test triggering, who needs to know, and what do you need to know?
Well, it's much better if everyone knows, right? Maybe the product owners don't need to know it deeply. They need to know that it exists and that some experiments might be more complex than others, right? But the people implementing the experiments, they of course need to know those about it, right? Or at least they need to know
The
that
person
they
designing the test should absolutely know about it, because they're the one that is creating the specifications that they're communicating to the person that's building it, if they're not also the person building it.
Or at least they should be aware that they are ignoring it and that they are losing power because of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. Like there's probably levels of like how deep someone should be understand it, but everybody should at least at a conceptual level know like okay, we want to include versus exclude this set of users based on a particular criteria. Now, how the criteria gets executed, right? The technical details are up to the person building the test, and so there's going to be like degrees of knowledge, right? The CEO that's making the decision based on the test results, they probably, they don't need to know like the nitty gritty details of all of the test targeting conditions, but they at least need to like have confidence that the test was run well.
Yeah, what I believe is that at some point when they start running more and more experiments, they will start thinking, hey, we're not able to measure anything in this experiment. Could we maybe measure it if we would have done it right with the right trigger, right? Then people, as they run better experiments,
getting in your reps and like having a better understanding of like, okay, like when you run your first experiment, you're maybe not as familiar with it, but then after you run your 100th experiment, you're like, okay, now I get it.
Exactly.
So the thing that I was going to ask about is server side versus client side tools. Are there any notable differences or experiences or limitations between a platform that does server side testing versus a platform that does client side testing in regards to targeting, like how you can set up targeting, limitations of what it can or can't do? And well, that question is going to come down to like the actual tool itself, but
I think there's less of a difference between client side and server side than it is on SDK versus drag and drop, like a visual editor, right? Because if you use an SDK to trigger the experiments, you need to code the experiments, either it is a client side or server side, or sometimes you don't even know if it is client side or server side. It's the same code that runs like if you use Next.js, for example, right? So sometimes the code will be running on the server, other times will be running on the client, but it's the same code, right? So you just wrote this piece of code and you don't know where it is running. I think the difference is bigger if you have like a visual editor where you just drag stuff on the client versus an SDK type of experiment, even if it is a client-side one only, right? Because the difference here is, are you using developers to set up your tests, or are you using your marketers that are just drag and drop stuff, right? That don't have that deeper
goes back
knowledge
to
about
the tool and experience limitations. Like,
because you really don't know. Then it's kind of a black box in terms of how the testing tool is triggering users into a test versus being really aware and
in
really
control of it,
and in control of it, which is I think always a better sort of way to go about it.
I think a good example of that, and I've seen this across multiple tools, is you're running a test and you want to check for presence of an element. Because say, like you're running a test on the product page and you want to test presence of like review stars. Well, not every product has reviews, so you don't want to run the test on product pages that don't have reviews. So you're doing some kind of like element check to see like, hey, are the review stars present on the page? And that's your like targeting conditions. Like,
Yeah.
it's simple enough to write a JavaScript. And in fact, most tools usually have some sort of help doc to like, here's the code that you put into the tool to say like check for the element, and then just feed it the selector. But you're still having to like manually write that code. Like, I know, so I've have practical experience recently in like both VWO and Convert in doing that. And it's still, you're using like a generic JavaScript condition and writing your own code to check for that. Whereas they could very easily build out, part of the visual editor, like here's your like targeting condition for checking for element presence, instead of having to do this code fallback. Because it's a templated bit of code. Like I literally just copy paste it because from my little snippet file that I keep, and all I have to do is change the selector every time. And it's like,
Yeah,
why not?
that's
Why
what I
not
was
just add that to the tool? Like you have, URL based targeting and stuff. Like here's the next level.
exactly. Yeah, that's what I was mentioning with a tool like that versus an SDK, right? If you are using an SDK, you write the code inside of the page or the component of that element only, so you will only trigger when that component is loaded.
Yeah.
Right. In that case, you don't need to think about, hey, I need to check if this element is on the page. No, that when that component is loaded, it is on the page, right? And then the trigger will only happen there. But if you are doing with an editor, client side only, and having to check if the element is there, then things get more messy, complicated. If the experiment is positive, you need to implement that change again in the code itself, not as an experiment, right? In the other one, the code the experiment, the code is already there, right? So you just need to clean up the feature flag. You just need to remove the if clause, and the code is already there. In the other version, you need to, maybe you implemented it in a slightly easier way for the experiment, but then you have to implement it correctly when it's a success and it stays in the code. You need to implement it back in the code in a different way, maybe. Things get a bit more messy there, right? So that's the difference that I was trying to mention.
Yeah. That could be a whole other topic in itself, of like thinking about like painted door tests, where you're sort of faking a feature entirely to evaluate if it should be built out or not. Like I've done that plenty of times. Like
that's even a different thing. We did a lot of that at Booking as well, right? It's but it's still baked in the code and not added on top with the visual or with the code editor on the client side only, right? You do it right in the code.
There's different trade-offs there as well. Of like if you're using a client side tool, it's having to deliver that JavaScript payload. So there's potentially paid performance issues if you're not maintaining your code payload well. Like as an example, with Convert, right, or with most other testing tools, like you want to make sure that you're archiving your completed experiments so that the code that is used to execute that experiment isn't being contributed to the file that's delivered, the JavaScript payload that's being delivered to the website, right? You got to keep that thing lean and trim. And so you need to have someone that's maintaining and managing and doing upkeep on that to make sure that you're not delivering code that's not doing stuff. Whereas if you're doing server side, like that's much less of an issue.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Anything else that anyone wants to talk about regarding targeting? Anything that we missed, or is that a pretty good overview of it for today? Parting thoughts.
I think everybody needs to be talking about this. Everybody needs to literally drop everything and start talking about test triggering. Okay. I think. Yeah.
So start like a separate like conference and convention of like,
There should be a specific conference for
just to
test
talk about targeting.
Yes.
Yeah, at least to be aware that it's a balance, right? That
Yes.
you need to know
Yeah.
about it to make a conscious decision if you want to use it or not, right? You might still not want to use it if you know that, I'm not adding much noise to the experiment, and it's a lot simpler to just go without it, right? That's fine, right? But it's important to think about it, and if you like many times you should use it, and maybe many times you should not use it as well, right? It's you just need to know about it.
Yeah.
I'd say with most of the off-the-shelf tools, there's at least some consideration of targeting up front, because when you're entering the test, like when you hit the build new test button, usually the first thing is like an input field for like a URL of where the test is going to run. So there's like at least some sort of like training by experience there of like, where do you want the test to run is the first thing you have to think about, or is it being enforced at like the test level or at the tool level? Well,
Yeah.
all right. If anybody has any questions, feedback, or disagree with something that we said, you can always talk to me and Iqbal face to face at the CRO Roundtable every Friday at
CRO Talks Roundtable.
the CRO Talks Roundtable. Oh, I always forget the branding. And that's at crotalks.com. You can find the link to that. If you ever want to talk to any of us directly, you can always reach us on LinkedIn, and that goes for all three of us. We're all fairly prolific on LinkedIn there. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.